Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone on a Sunday evening, and it is quite early for Mr. Kamal Gupta joining us from New York today. And I'm extremely excited to really introduce our esteemed author today for today's landmark episode. He's a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT, a master's in computer science from University of Wisconsin, Madison. He's a professional BlackJack player and a highly successful hedge fund manager for the largest of hedge funds possible in the world, like Millennium, Brevan Harvard, Exodus Point Capital. So he's Mr. Kamal Gupta. He's a consummate negotiator and a man who beat the odds on Wall Street, and is the author of the much anticipated book, Play It Right, his memoir about human ambition and beating the odds, whether at casino, Wall Street, and live. So welcome, Kamalji. It's such a privilege to have you with us on our platform.
Thank you very much. It's great to.
I would like to get into the questions straight away. I read the review on your book, and I have read the book in no time. It's such a fast read, and it's such an interesting read, absolutely engaging. And I really recommend everyone to read the book. You can always order it on the Amazon. The link will be in the chat shortly. The review, I was really fascinated by the title of the review, which went like a gambler in the casino called Wall Street. You say in the book that you don't think it was luck that brought you to Wall Street, but destiny. So please elaborate, Kamal, on that.
Well, the thing is, the last two lines of the book, which is about destiny, and the first two lines, which is, I'm on a Lehman Brothers trading floor, and there's something that's going to happen in the next 18 seconds that's going to change my life. And I write, I didn't know it then, but the entire course of my future hinged on those 18 seconds. So, I mean, the beginning and the ending of the book sort of bookend the entire story, which is, I didn't know it when I sent a random resume to Wall Street, that this is what I was meant to do. I mean, before that, I'd gambled for the last 2.5 years on just a whim, because I came across a blackjack table in Lake Tahoe. And then I spent 2.5 years gambling, never thinking that it would lead to a 27-year career on Wall Street and a book, and that you and I would be sitting here talking about this. It's like, so all these things are apparent only in hindsight. I didn't know it going in, and as the book details, I had a pretty rough time in my early years on Wall Street. But when I look back, this is what I was meant to do. And it's rare in life that you find what you were actually built to do. Like, my brain was wired to do what I did on Wall Street for the last 25, 26, 27 years. And then one day I was finished with it. And then thankfully my brain was capable of working on a book. So that's what I'm doing right now. So I really believe I fulfilled my destiny by working for this long on Wall Street, which is a really brutal environment. And it really taught me a lot of lessons about myself and about the world and how to combat problems. And the book details the story, but 2 years into my Wall Street career, as I'm getting married, I almost walked away from the whole thing because I was just so disgusted with the business and I was having such a difficult time that I didn't want to work in this business anymore. And then perspective, while I was away for 100 days, I decided to come back with a newfound resolve and then stayed for another 25 years.
So very right. But among all the roles that you've played in your life, among all the games that you've played in your life, you mention in the book that writing your memoir has been the greatest satisfaction. So I like to know about it. Why do you say that? And it is definitely the icing on the cake.
It's great that you picked up on that, because actually it's not even in the book. It's the first line of the acknowledgements, because it's like, the thing about a memoir is it allows you to relive your life over and over and over again. Because first you think about writing a book, then you think, okay, you start writing it, then it's chapter by chapter, like what aspects of your life are you going to include? Then you revise it, edit it, and it just goes through the publication process, which, I'm sure is a pretty excruciating one. So the thing about writing a memoir is you're reliving your life probably 10, 20, 50 times. And if you are happy with the net result, I think in spite of all the difficulties that I've faced, I was very happy to do this. And I never thought going in that the book would actually get published, and let alone, globally. And I just took a chance. I mean, this is why the book is called Beating the Odds. I mean, in fact, beating the odds in the publishing industry was even more remarkable, than what happened on Wall Street, because the odds of a completely unknown writer who's never written a one-page article before to actually put together an entire book that people are willing to publish is mind-boggling.
So very right. And you put together all the facts, your story of maybe over 3 decades, and you've strung it all together. It must have been really, really nice to go down the memory lane and come with a winner of a book.
Hopefully.
We'll so definitely it is. I've been really going through the reviews and obviously your various interviews, and I've gone through the book. And I must say that definitely it is worth a read and going back and, getting inspired from your story. You also mentioned that in gambling and high finance, probability of success in each case is pretty small. Negative reactions for both did not really dissuade you.
Right.
So, I know you just mentioned that, but what was the main inspiration? When did you really think that you need to kind of really write this? And you knew that you had an inspirational story to tell the world. And when did you really decide that this was high time you write a story of yours? Because I'm sure there's so many more miles.
There is a very specific event that precipitated the book. Because I always had the beginning of the book, which is chapter 1, right? That happened almost 3 decades ago. The middle of the book was always there. It's like, what happened to me before Wall Street and during Wall Street. The question was, where does the story end? And in spring of 2018, I started working for a startup hedge fund called Exodus Point. And, I was recruited because I was one of the earliest employees to help them raise money. And even though I'd worked for hedge funds for almost 20 years at that point, I'd never taken part in any sort of marketing effort, because large hedge funds keep their 2 functions, marketing and investing, completely distinct from each other. So it was my first time marketing. And I was really confronted with, how do I go about doing this? Something I've never done before. I mean, as you can see from the book, that is not going to dissuade me. So I go in and I decide that what is marketing if not the telling of a good story? And there is only one story that I'm qualified to tell, which is my own. So I go into these meetings with some of the largest investors in the world that collectively manage literally trillions of dollars with a T. And I tell them my life story, starting from India and electrical engineering, being bored with that, coming to the US, computers, being bored with that, then BlackJack, then Wall Street, and how I used a method similar to BlackJack to manage money for 25 odd years. And it was amazing to me see how fascinated people were with the story. And so 2 things happened. One is partly because of my efforts, over the next 3 to 6 months, Exodus Point, raised a lot of money. In June of 2018, it became the largest hedge fund launch in history. And that's when I knew I had the ending for the book. So 2 weeks after that, I wrote the first line of the book, which is 18 seconds on the clock. Someone said, go.
So very right. And there's so much more than that. I mean, you clearing the IIT, I mean, not many people know about that, in the 11th grade itself, getting admission into IIT Delhi, then also completing your master's in 11 months, everything. You've been an inspiration, coping up with arthritis from the age of 15 and not letting any of these setbacks really bring you back. So I think the highest point in that book is how you have coped up with all the challenges in the life. You've become only stronger with each challenge that you faced. So hats off to you. And what lesson do you think we should all derive from your book? I've already read mine.
I think the lesson of the book is twofold, and they're both played right, in the sense that that's why the title of the book, which comes from a clip from the Kenny Rogers song, The Gambler. I mean, what a better song to pick. It's about playing virtually anything that I've done in my life. I've perceived it as a game. And it's about playing the game right from 2 standpoints. One is obviously the methodology. of how the game should be played. Like, for example, BlackJack and Wall Street. There's a clear mathematical component to it. And if you don't, and the method is about turning the odds in your favor, whether in a casino or on Wall Street. So that's a purely theoretical, mathematical, and intellectual exercise. But then beyond that, there's a whole component of playing it right morally, which is very difficult to do in both industries. I mean, I call them low and high finance because casinos are considered like a degenerate gambling, environment. So in both low and high finance, there's a real crisis of morality, and that was very difficult for me to deal. It was easy for me to deal with it in the casinos because it was simple, right? It was black and white. Casinos are evil. They throw card counters out, which is completely unfair. So I'm going to battle them and teach them a lesson. So that was a very clear moral imperative. On Wall Street, it was a little more murky because, I mean, the whole industry is so focused on money, and that virtually anything gets sacrificed in the pursuit of money. And to me, the game was much more important than the amount of money I could make. And I actually have a line in the book, which is, and I really believe this, that the key to happiness lies in playing the game well during the day and sleeping well at night. And it sounds like a simple statement, but sleeping well at night is a very loaded line, because sleeping well at night means you don't have too much rest. You haven't done anything particularly evil during the day. You don't have anything weighing on your conscience. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into, like the vast majority of people I know on Wall Street do not sleep well at night for a whole host of reasons. So these were the two. So my whole point is to take life as a game and try to play it right from a method standpoint, and also have a moral angle to how you're playing the game.
So very right. All this time, whether it is BlackJack or Wall Street, you have never sold your soul anywhere, as I notice, as you've always played it right and you've played it very fair. So I think it has always meant to you a lot, as you just mentioned.
Well, there's one chapter which actually describes how I sort of felt like I was selling my soul. I think it's chapter maybe 8, I think. Yes, it's called The Kitchen Sink Deal, where I'm in my first year at Lehman Brothers, and I end up structuring a deal which I know is going to lose investors a large amount of money. And that had a lot to do with my decision to leave the industry for 3.5 months. But I mean, I admit freely in the book that, I mean, my hands weren't entirely clean either, but I knew I was a part of a system that I did not want to be a part of. And that taught me a very valuable lesson, that I have to extricate myself from this setup. So you're right. I mean, I've tried to be, it's not always possible, but to the best of my ability, I've tried to follow a straight path.
Dia, will you please take it forward? Yeah, your questions. Yes.
So hedge funds, they are known to be of high risk, of course. There's something with extreme chance of money loss. So you got into BlackJack because, of course, your computer job, it got repetitive, and there was something that sort of piqued your interest. I have to ask, what made you get into hedge funds? Were you looking for something else that was exciting? Was the decision a leap of faith or calculated according to some research you had?
No, it was not a leap of faith. It was, while playing BlackJack, there's distinctly two sides to a casino, right? There is the casino, which is establishment, and there is the player, like people like me who are trying to beat the casino, which, I mean, the casinos would not be standing unless vast majority of people did not lose money on a sustained basis. But some people can manage to beat the casinos, which is what I managed to do. Now, one of the most distressing things for me when I came to Wall Street, and this shows my complete lack of knowledge about the industry, is when I started working for Lehman Brothers and a few other investment banks after that, I realized I'm no longer a player of the game, I'm a dealer. So the Wall Street investment banks are dealers of the game, and the players of the game are like investors, which are bank portfolios and hedge funds and insurance companies, whoever is a client of Wall Street. So it took me a few months to realize that I'm on the wrong side of the fence. And how did I become part of the evil empire that was the casinos? I mean, now I'm working for the house. So I decided that as soon as possible, I have to be on the other side of the fence, which is to become a player. But then to play the game, I mean, I felt like I needed a method. And without a method, there is no chance of beating the game. And what is the point of playing the game if you don't have a good chance of beating it? So it took me 7 years to figure out a method. And during that time, I stayed employed by the house or the dealer community or investment banks. But after 7 years, I had a method. And I ended up working for hedge funds partly because that was the first opportunity I got on the buy side at a hedge fund unit inside a very large Swiss bank. But then the thing about hedge funds that makes them attractive, apart from a whole host of problems, like they're highly risk, prone and all that stuff. But hedge funds are the truest form of meritocracy that I know on Wall Street and perhaps the world, because it's very simple. If you perform, you thrive. You don't, you're out. It's like it's very black and white. And talking about black and white, I actually even have a line in the book where I say, hedge fund owners and investors are also colorblind. They don't care if you're black, white, or brown, as long as you can make them some green. So it was a natural place for someone who only cares about playing the game in a certain fashion, to his own satisfaction, to go. Now, that doesn't mean that life was easy at hedge funds, because there's all sorts of pressures to take more and more risk. So I had to combat that. And I sort of detail that in the book as well. But the reason I worked for hedge funds for 20 years is in order to become a player of the game, which is what I was before I came to Wall Street. I had no interest in being a dealer.
Right. Wow. That is very interesting. Very well said, Serge. You've actually answered a part of my next question. So what was the common rule, do you think, that you adopted in being a successful BlackJack player and Wall Street professional?
Actually, there are 3 important rules that, it's funny. I wrote an article for a financial website. We'll see if it gets published, but I'll just tell you the 3 rules verbally. You need to have a method, which we've talked about. 2, you need to have the discipline to stay with that method, because just having a method is of no use if you chuck it during bad times, or you become overconfident during good times and start doubling or tripling your bets. In both cases, you're eventually going to be ruined. So it's a question of having a method, having the discipline to stay with the method in good times and bad. And finally, the third and the most vital component is you should have a large enough bankroll. So for instance, when I was gambling, it might sound crazy, but my BlackJack bankroll was 400 times my average bet. Because BlackJack is a very volatile game and you can lose massive amounts in just 1 hour. So to protect against sustained losing streaks, even if you have the odds in your favor, I employed a bankroll of 400 times my average bet. So if you're betting an average bet of $100, your bankroll will be something like $40,000, which sounds like a crazy ratio, but that's what works to keep your probability of losing it all to well under 5%. I followed the exact same path on Wall Street, and to great chagrin of my bosses, I've only ever utilized a very small fraction of my risk limit. Now, in hedge fund world, risk limit is the same as bankroll. Like, how much risk can you take? Like, what is the size of your bets allowed to be? And without exception, every hedge fund boss I've had has urged me to take more and more and more risk. And it has taken a lot of maneuvering on my part to keep them at bay. Because, to me, playing the game well and beating the casino on a $25 table is enough. It doesn't have to be a $100 or $200 table. Same thing in hedge funds. I'm not overly greedy. I'm there to play a game, and I know if I play the game well and I beat the market, then the natural outcome of that is money in both casinos and on Wall Street. So, I think those are the 3 big components: having a system or a method, making sure you follow it to a T in good times and bad, and making sure your bankroll is large enough to withstand short-term fluctuations.
Right, sir. I have to say, although it's no surprise, your knowledge is unbeatable. Because I was reading the book too, and it got me hooked. So you've also mentioned that writing this book was not easy. Like, you faced many difficulties. So I have to ask, what was the most difficult part of it? Since you have done so many great things, was it easy to get everything together and recollecting experiences?
it was the whole book journey. I could write a book about that itself. There were some very serious highs and very big lows in this process, and it was almost like a roller coaster ride, because I started writing the book in summer of 2018, and chapter 1 was fairly easy to put together because it's a dramatic story and how the book opens, and I sent. In the fall of 2019, about a year and a quarter later, I sent that to a very prominent literary agent in New York. And I mean, I'm sure in publishing, you need an agent, and getting an agent for an unknown writer is something like 1,000 to 1 odds. And this person is an extremely well-known, very powerful literary agent who's represented presidents, of America. And she immediately signs me, like on the basis of 1 chapter. And I am thrilled. Now, this is like 3 years ago, and I feel like I've arrived in the world of publishing because I have this great agent. Well, 3 months later, I had to fire her because she was trying to bully me into writing a book that I did not want to write. Because her contention was, this book cannot be about you. It has to be about Wall Street I said, well, it is about Wall Street, but from a perspective of an Indian immigrant gambler who doesn't really care about money. I mean, that's a pretty unique perspective, But it was clear that the gap between us was unbridgeable. So we parted ways. That was a very big low point because getting an agent is extremely difficult. Now I have to go back into the trenches and look for one. But it took me another 6 months and I found the perfect agent. And he deserves a lot of the credit for the way the narrative has been crafted, because he converted a book that was an arm's length look at Wall Street to a highly personal narrative, saying the opposite of what the first agent has said. The first agent had said, this book cannot be about you. Whereas Sam, who's my current agent, said, this book can only be about you. So it's just a complete dichotomy, right? And we worked very hard, over the book for the next I worked 12-hour days for like maybe a year. And before we had a draft, that we could send to publishers, and, we sent to publishers in North America as well as India. And it took some time to get some contracts in place, with publishing contracts, with ECW in North America and Bloomsbury in India. And then it was another extraordinary amount of effort to actually produce the book. So now I went into gambling not knowing anything about BlackJack. I came to Wall Street not knowing the first thing about finance. I started writing a book not knowing anything about the publishing industry. But now, with bitter experience, I've learned how foolish the whole pursuit was. I'm glad it all worked out, but it was far from guaranteed. And I say the odds of success in gambling and Wall Street are low. But it could be argued that odds of success in publishing industry are even lower. So
that sounds like definitely a huge journey with a lot of turns and obstacles in the way. Sir, you know better than anybody how it is to transition into the finance world, as you had no background in it. That does sound quite surprising on the basis of your knowledge and experience, of course. If somebody was a beginner looking to learn more about the world stocks, trading, what would you recommend them to do? Where would you recommend them to start?
That's a tough question, because this is something I thought a lot about when I first came to Wall Street. And one thing that was clear to me, unlike BlackJack, where there are a lot of books you could read about methodology and how to go about playing the game from a mathematical standpoint. There's a whole other game of how you don't get thrown out of casinos, but that's different. On Wall Street, when I showed up here, I knew that there was no book I could read, that I would have to create an investment method from scratch, and that's why it takes me 7 years, because it's a difficult problem to solve. And then I spent 1 year, I took 1 year off from 2012 to 2013 from the financial industry to devote it solely to the stock market. So I spent 1 year researching the stock market. So all I can tell you is how I went about doing it. And hopefully, people can gain some lessons from that. I knew that I was going to invest only on the basis of fundamentals. I wanted to understand the fair value of any stock. And the starting point for me was the financials of a company. So it sounds crazy in hindsight, but the S&P 500, which has 500 stocks in it.
Right.
I picked the top 300 and went through the balance sheet, income statements, and the stock, whatever, just the financials of 300 of those 500 companies. And I found 10 or 15 that were worth owning. And those are the ones I went and bought. So my advice is there is no substitute for hard work. And you have to go in and look at these companies very carefully and figure out what their business plan is. And I was looking for a certain kind of company, which is like stable earnings and, a well easy to explain business plan and so on and so forth. And I wanted to make sure the companies had no debt, because I'm not a believer in borrowing money and making money off of that, because that's what I've been a part of for a very long time. So I think there is no substitute. I mean, maybe you can read some books for some basic fundamentals, but don't expect that a book will teach you how to invest, because anybody who can successfully beat the market will keep doing so. He's not going to write a book and tell you how to do it. Like, for instance, in my book, there's a chapter on the mortgage market, like on the puzzle, how I went about dealing with it. But even that chapter, as much as I try to explain it, it's impossible to take that chapter and try to figure out how to manage money using it. I mean, I wrote the chapter because I want people to know that if the book is called Play It Right, there has to be something about the methodology in financial markets as well. It can't be just, and I talk about the methodology of BlackJack as well. So I think my only advice is no substitute for hard work. You have to investigate and you have to understand, then also there is no substitute for time. You have to spend time in financial markets. So the 7 years I spent figuring out a method was also a critical 7 years in terms of seeing the market's ups and downs. And then you have to find a niche in the market that you can operate in, where you have an advantage. And then you stay there, like I did for 20 years. I found a niche and I stayed there for 20 years and never left it until I actually left the financial industry.
So very right. We have Rishabh Tandon. He would like to ask you a question directly. But in the meantime, there's a question from Major Neha. She says that in such a high pressurized job, what did you do to de-stress? Was it writing a book?
Well, no, I wrote the book almost at the end of my financial career. De-stress, it's difficult to say what. The way I de-stressed myself in the financial industry by having a method that I was convinced had turned the odds in my favor. So whatever losses I suffered, and I suffered a lot of losses from time to time, I knew were temporary, like losing streaks in Vegas. And I knew the odds are with me. And as long as I keep playing the game in a controlled fashion, it will all turn around. And it did. So I think the way I avoided stress in the financial industry is by making sure I had a method that I believed in and had the discipline to stay with it. And again, the bankroll. Like my bankroll was huge compared to my bets. So short-term fluctuations are not going to wipe me out, which is the opposite of how people play it in the hedge fund world. They try to make massive bets to make a massive amount of money as quickly as possible. Whereas my objective was to just make the game last for as long as possible.
So, Rishabh, he's in the hospitality business, and Rishabh would like to ask your question directly. Yes, Rishabh. Oh, you're muted.
That's not going to work.
Okay, thanks. Hello, Mr. Gupta. Thank you for sharing your inspiring journey with all of us. Just wanted to know a few more tips from you. Like your background, a lot of engineers from India, they eventually make their careers in the US. And I know quite a few of them eventually go in areas like actuarial finance or in the sector. How do you see the future, especially after this COVID disruption in the world of finance, engineer moving into the world of finance in the US?
That's a tough one because I left the financial industry just before COVID. So I spent the entire COVID, like 2-3 years, writing a book in my office, which is where I'm sitting right now. So it's hard for me to say, there's a lot of IIT graduates who end up on Wall Street, but they all have some sort of a business degree or a degree in some kind of a financial, engineering sort of a thing. So that's a well-worn path. Now, I don't know of anybody who came to the US and became a gambler and then ended up on Wall Street. And I would not recommend that course of action as much as it worked out for me. I mean, I was just wired that way. So I think in terms of IIT to Wall Street, I think that potential is still there. But I'm not sure it's a path that's for everyone. And I would actually recommend most people not follow it, because I just happened to find something that my brain was wired for. But this is a really difficult industry. And I think most people are not well suited for it. And by and large, when people do end up here, there is just the whole money aspect of it takes over, and you end up doing things that you may not necessarily want to. And so I think the possibility is there, but I think hopefully the book also serves as a cautionary tale of what can go wrong, because a lot goes wrong with me in my first 2 or 3 years, especially. And, I even get fired once, which I detail I describe in some detail in the book. So, I mean, it's not smooth sailing. It's not an easy path. But if you want to take risks in life, calculated risks, sure.
Thank you. Sure. But your voice is again gone. Can you? Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, sir, you also mentioned sleep as a very important ingredient in life to play it right. Can you please share a few more tips? How do you ensure that you get a complete stress-free sleep and then be super productive for the next day?
It's not always possible, but this is, so as long as I feel during the day, there are two things. As long as I feel like during the day I tried my level best to do whatever I was trying to do, that helps me sleep at night, regardless of what the outcome may be. I mean, it's more on the basis of my efforts. And secondly, if you're exhausted by the time you go to bed, that's the best recipe for getting a good night's sleep. So if you worked hard enough on something, it doesn't have to be physical labor, it could be anything. It could be gambling or working on Wall Street or writing a book. These are all exhausting activities. I mean, even chess players sitting in a match, lose pounds and pounds of weight, during the course of a tournament, even though it seems like they're just sitting still. So I think I really believe whatever game you've chosen for yourself, as long as you're playing it well during the day and you're tired by the time the night rolls around, you will get a good night's sleep.
Thank you, Rishabh, and thank you, Mr. Kamal. What fantastic answers to all the questions. We have a few more questions.
Okay.
Neeraj Kohli has sent in a very, very good question. I must read it out to you. You were a blackjack player. Counting cards is a maths, so you know the outcome, right? But trading is more like poker. There is always uncertainty. So how did you make the transition?
That's exactly what I did. Trading is extremely uncertain. And it's a game, like he said, it's more like poker in the sense that blackjack is a game of perfect information, whereas Wall Street and poker are both games of imperfect information. So what I did, and that's why it took me 7 years, is to strip everything away from the uncertainty of financial markets and to find a narrow slice in the market where I felt the fair value of any trade or any construct was knowable with certainty. So that's why it takes 7 years, because first, I don't know anything about finance to begin with. So first I have to train myself in understanding how this industry works, and then to figure out a method. So like he said, he's right. He's right about what he thinks about Wall Street and markets. But at the same time, you can find, certain constructs. I mean, we can't go over them here, but at least in the markets I operated in, I found a way of trading it where I felt the fair value was knowable with certainty, which means, there's a certain level of noise, but if it drops far below its fair value, then I'll buy it. And the further it drops, and I actually detail in the book how I actually go about trading, even though I have a pretty good idea of where the fair value is. I still trade in very small increments, because I know just because I think something is fair at a certain level, the market is not going to agree with it. So the answer to the question is, you find a niche in the game, So because I came from a BlackJack background, I wanted to have a BlackJack type methodology where I had a finite, small, but provable mathematical advantage in financial markets. So that's what I did.
Fantastic. And the second part is, what gave you the ultimate high in both these professions? There's
no high in any of these. So, I mean, for me, there was no high while gambling. And there's some stories about what happens to people I go to the casinos with. While I'm staying cool and calm and collected, they just go to pieces. But there was the one thing, gambling, it does provide a high to a lot of people, but then that's the wrong way to pursue it. Gambling, finance, Wall Street, I mean, all of these things are carefully calculated moves that you're making, and you're not really gambling, you're investing in your future if the odds are with you. So at every moment, you're just trying to figure out how to play the next hand to the best of your ability to maximize your return, how to place the next trade, to maximize your ROE, and so there is no concept of high, because high by definition implies the level of addiction, which means you will do suboptimal things. So the word high and careful and calculating are not compatible with each other.
So Neeraj, you have to read the book to understand everything that Mr. Kamal Gupta has been talking about. And in fact, there's last question from Sarika Jain. She'd sent it earlier. She could not join in. Over the last 3 decades, you have had 4 separate professions: a computer scientist, a blackjack player, a job on Wall Street, and now an author. So what is the common link that drives you through?
Oh, there is one simple common link. It's my propensity to take calculated risks. So, I mean, if I feel that, and risk reward favoring you doesn't always have to mean that it has to be 51-49 in your favor. It can even be against you if the payoff is huge enough. Like, for instance, if you have a chance of 1 in 100 chance of winning something, but the payoff is 1,000 times, then you're supposed to play that game over and over again. So I felt the risk reward in all of these ventures was worth going down the path of. And in terms of writing a book, the reward is not financial. I mean, nobody writes a book to get rich. I mean, I've learned that through having gone through publishing contracts. So I wrote the book partly because I had a story to tell. And my wife, Kathleen, who's heavily featured in the book, she always thought I should write some sort of a motivational book, which I was never going to do, because I feel that the idea of writing a motivational book is dry and boring. But then I figured if I just tell my story, hopefully there is some motivation to be taken away from that. And so the common strain in all of these activities is that I'm willing to take a risk where I think the risk reward favors me in the long run. It doesn't have, writing a book took me 4 years. Figuring out a method took me 7 years. So I'm willing to spend the time to turn the odds in my favor, or to have a reasonable risk reward profile.
What a fantastic and motivational story you have. And it was so much fun reading the book. Any last words that you would like to tell the viewers who are present here and people who will watch it on YouTube later?
I just hope people read the book. I tried to make it very entertaining. The book is funny.
Yes.
And I've tried to make it funny more than anything else. Even when I'm going through difficult times, I've sort of tried to maintain a sense of humor about the whole thing. And some things you just cannot make funny, but by and large, there is a sense of humor that runs throughout the book. And there's sort of a sarcastic attitude towards everything that's going on around me. And I think people will enjoy it. And I also try to make it very easy to turn the page, that it's very smooth flowing. And all of this, for someone who had never written anything before, was very difficult to do. But hopefully it works out,
Thank you for such an inspiring tale. And there have been 2 lucky winners today, Rishabh Tandon and Neeraj Kohli, who won your book. And the rest can definitely, we have put the link on the chat. You can always order it Amazon. You'll definitely love it. And thank you for being on our platform. It means so much to us. And
thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And thank you, Bloomsbury, for putting this session together. And thank you, everyone. And do subscribe to our channel, Trends Literature Series, and share the content so that more and more people can benefit from these lovely conversations that we have with such aspiring authors like Mr. Kamal. Thank you, Mr. Kamal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thank you.